In the heart of the city, a chance encounter between two women would set off a chain of events neither of them expected. One woman, named Sarah, a fit and determined woman in her early 30s, was of European descent. She had spent her life working hard, achieving her goals, and trying to navigate the world with her head held high. The other, Nyla, a strong and independent African-American woman, had walked a similar path, yet her experiences had shaped her differently. Their lives, though seemingly parallel, were soon to collide in a dramatic and emotional way that would change their perspectives forever. Chapter 1. The busy street. Sarah had just finished her usual afternoon run. Her blonde hair was slick with sweat, her breath coming in heavy, rhythmic gasps as she made her way through the crowded city streets. She loved this city, despite its rough edges. It was where she'd built her life, where she'd fought for everything she had. But today, something was different. There was tension in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Nyla, on the other hand, was on her way to an important meeting. She was running late, her dark, curly hair pulled into a high bun, and her athletic build drew attention. As she hurried down the sidewalk, she felt eyes on her, as she often did, and her guard was up. She was used to people making assumptions about her based on her appearance. It was something she had dealt with all her life. Their paths crossed at a narrow corner of the street. Neither woman noticed the other until it was too late. Chapter 2. The collision. With both moving at full speed, the impact was inevitable. Sarah, distracted by her thoughts, and Nyla, focused on her phone, collided in a forceful crash. Bags dropped, phones flew, and in an instant, frustration boiled over. "Watch where you're going," Sarah snapped, her voice sharp and impatient. "Excuse me? You ran into me," Nyla retorted, her tone equally heated. Neither woman was willing to back down. It was a minor accident, but the tension between them escalated quickly. Sarah's frustration from her day, combined with her own underlying prejudices she wasn't fully aware of, surfaced. Nyla, always on guard, felt the sting of those unspoken judgments and responded defensively. "Typical," Sarah muttered under her breath, thinking Nyla wouldn't hear, but Nyla heard. And that single word set her off. "What did you just say?" she demanded, stepping closer to Sarah, her fists clenched. Years of dealing with subtle, and not so subtle, racism fueled her anger. Sarah, realizing she had crossed a line, hesitated but couldn't bring herself to apologize. "I didn't mean it like that," she said, though the words felt hollow. "You think I don't know what you meant? You don't know anything about me," Nyla shouted, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. The argument grew louder, drawing the attention of passers-by. Some stopped to watch, others kept walking, but in the chaos of the moment, neither woman noticed the flashing lights of a police car pulling up to the curb. Chapter 3. The intervention. 2 officers stepped out of the car. Officer Daniels, an older, calm man, and Officer Martinez, a younger, more impulsive cop, approached the women, trying to assess the situation. The argument was still in full swing, with Sarah and Nyla hurling accusations at each other. "Ma'am, we need you both to calm down," Officer Daniels said, his voice firm but kind. "She started it," Sarah said, pointing at Nyla. "I started it? You ran into me," Nyla shot back, her arms crossed defensively. Officer Daniels held up his hand, silencing both women. "I don't care who started it. What's important now is that we resolve this peacefully. We're not here to take sides. We're here to help." Officer Martinez, less patient, stepped forward. "You both need to cool it, or we're taking you in for disturbing the peace." That threat hung in the air, and for the first time, both women seemed to realize how out of control the situation had gotten. They stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. Officer Daniels, seeing the tension begin to ease, spoke again. "Look, you both had a rough moment. But yelling at each other isn't going to fix anything. Maybe you just need to talk it out." Sarah and Nyla, still fuming, glared at each other. Neither wanted to be the first to speak, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. They were standing on a busy street, with the police involved, and all over what had originally been a simple accident. Chapter 4, The conversation. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Sarah finally broke. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words were strained. "I didn't mean for it to escalate like this." Nyla eyed her warily. "Sorry for what? For bumping into me, or for the way you treated me after?" Sarah hesitated, the weight of Nyla's words sinking in. "Both, I guess," she admitted, though it still didn't feel like enough. "I didn't mean to assume things about you." Nyla softened slightly but kept her guard up. "That's the problem. You assumed. Just because I look a certain way, you think you know me. But you don't." Sarah, feeling the shame rise in her chest, nodded. "You're right. I don't know you. I don't know your story. And I shouldn't have said what I did." Officer Daniels, watching the conversation unfold, gave a small nod to his partner. "We'll give you two a minute," he said, motioning for Officer Martinez to follow him back to the CAR.as. The officers stepped away, the street seemed quieter, the noise of the city fading into the background. Sarah and Nyla stood there, two strangers who had started off on the wrong foot but were now facing the uncomfortable truth about themselves and each other. Chapter 5, Shared Stories. Nyla took a deep breath, her anger finally subsiding. "You know, it's not easy walking around feeling like people are always judging you. It's exhausting." Sarah looked down at her feet, feeling a pang of guilt. "I can't imagine what that's like," she said honestly. "I've never had to deal with that." Nyla nodded, appreciating Sarah's honesty. "It's not something I want to have to think about all the time, but it's always there. And when someone like you, when you make assumptions about me, it just brings all of that back." "I get it," Sarah said softly. "I really do. And I'm sorry for adding to that. I've never thought of myself as, well, you know, but I guess that doesn't matter if I'm still making people feel that way." Nyla studied her for a moment, then let out a sigh. "It's hard. I get frustrated too. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. I've just been dealing with a lot lately, and when you said what you said, it just hit a nerve." Sarah looked up, meeting Nyla's eyes for the first time since their argument began. "We all have stuff we're dealing with," she said. "But that doesn't mean we should take it out on each other." Nyla nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Yeah, you're right." Chapter 6, A new understanding. The tension between them had lifted, replaced by a tentative understanding. They didn't know each other's full stories, but they had taken the first step toward seeing each other as more than just strangers on the street. The police officers, having watched from a distance, approached again. "Everything good here?" Officer Daniels asked. Sarah and Nyla exchanged a glance before both nodded. "Yeah, we're good," Nyla said. Officer Daniels smiled. "Glad to hear it. Remember, it's easy to get caught up in the moment, but it's always better to talk things through." As the officers walked back to their car, Sarah turned to Nyla. "I'm really sorry," she said again, this time with more sincerity. Nyla smiled, the warmth in her expression surprising even herself. "Me too." They stood there for a moment longer before parting ways, not as friends, but as people who had learned something important about themselves and each other. Epilogue. Moving forward in the days and weeks that followed, both Sarah and Nyla reflected on what had happened. They didn't run into each other again, but the encounter stayed with them. It was a reminder that, despite their differences, they were both just trying to make their way in the world, dealing with their own struggles and challenges, and sometimes, all it took was a moment of understanding to turn a conflict into a connection, however brief it might be. The city continued to bustle around them, but for Sarah and Nyla, that one moment of misunderstanding had become a lesson in empathy, reminding them both that the world was a little more complicated than they had once thought. Chapter 7, Reflection and Growth. In the days following their intense confrontation, both Sarah and Nyla found themselves replaying the incident over and over in their minds. The city had returned to its usual pace, and life moved on. But for these two women, something had shifted. The raw emotions, the argument, the reconciliation, each of these moments lingered like an unfinished conversation. For Sarah, the encounter was a wake-up call. She hadn't realized how deeply ingrained her assumptions about people were. Sure, she prided herself on being open-minded, on treating people fairly, but Nyla's words had exposed a blind spot. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that came with recognizing her own flaws. On her morning runs, she started to notice things she hadn't before. She noticed the way people of different races and backgrounds seemed to move through the city in invisible lines, barely intersecting unless by accident. She realized that her own experiences, while valid, were not the universal standard. The world was bigger than her perspective. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city skyline, Sarah pulled out her phone and began researching topics on unconscious bias and privilege. She knew the incident with Nyla wasn't just a one-time thing. It was part of a much larger conversation she had been unaware of. She decided it was time to educate herself. Chapter 8, Nyla's struggles. For Nyla, the experience brought back memories she had tried to bury. Growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, she had always been the other, always fighting to prove her worth. Over time, she had built walls around herself, using her strength and independence as a shield against the constant microaggressions she faced. But the encounter with Sarah had shaken her. It wasn't just the argument, it was how quickly she had let her guard down afterward. How she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, even for a moment, in front of a stranger. It made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was room for understanding and growth even in the most unexpected places. One afternoon, Nyla found herself sitting in a cafe, watching people go about their lives. She thought about how exhausting it was to always be on the defensive. Maybe she had been too hard on Sarah. After all, the woman had apologized, and in the end, they had come to an understanding. Was it possible that she, too, had her own assumptions that needed to be challenged? Nyla sighed, sipping her coffee. She decided to call her best friend, Keisha, who had always been a voice of reason in her life. "Hey, Kuish," Nyla said when her friend picked up. "I need to talk." Keisha listened as Nyla recounted the entire incident, from the collision to the police intervention and their eventual reconciliation. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You know what I think?" Keisha finally said. "I think you both learned something important that day. It's not easy to face your own biases, whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end. But the fact that you both walked away with a new perspective? That's huge." Nyla nodded, even though Keisha couldn't see her. "Yeah, I guess you're right. It just caught me off guard, you know. I've dealt with this stuff my whole life, and I wasn't expecting her to be so open about it afterward." "People can surprise you," Keisha said. "And maybe that's a good thing." Chapter 9, Unexpected Encounters. Several weeks had passed, and both women had gone back to their normal routines. The incident was no longer fresh, but it wasn't forgotten either. The city, with all its chaos and unpredictability, continued to be a place where people's paths crossed in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Sarah found herself walking down the same street where the argument had occurred. She hadn't been back to that area since the confrontation, and as she approached the spot, memories of the day flooded her mind. She felt a mix of emotions, shame, growth, and a strange sense of closure. Just as she was about to turn the corner, she spotted a familiar face. Nyla was walking out of a nearby cafe, headphones in her ears, her focus on her phone as she absent-mindedly sipped a smoothie. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Should she say something? Would Nyla even remember her? Or was it better to leave things as they were, resolved, but not revisited? Before she could make up her mind, Nyla looked up and their eyes met. There was a moment of recognition, followed by an awkward smile from both sides. Sarah raised her hand in a tentative wave, and to her relief, Nyla smiled back. "Hey," Sarah said as she approached. "Fancy seeing you here." Nyla chuckled, pulling out her headphones. "Yeah, small world, huh?" They stood there for a moment, the awkwardness of their last encounter lingering in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt almost normal. "How've you been?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Nyla shrugged. "Good, I guess. Just working, staying busy." "You?" "Same. I've been doing some thinking, actually. About what happened." Nyla nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, me too." There was a brief pause before Sarah continued. "I know we didn't part on bad terms or anything, but I just wanted to say again, I'm really sorry for the way I acted that day." Nyla smiled, this time more genuinely. "I appreciate that. And honestly, I'm sorry too. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions so quickly." They both laughed, the tension between them finally dissolving into something lighter, something resembling the beginning of an understanding that went beyond their differences. Chapter 10, a new connection. Over the next few months, Sarah and Nyla found themselves running into each other more often, not by accident, but by design. What had started as a chance meeting had blossomed into an unlikely friendship. They began meeting up for coffee or the occasional run, bonding over shared experiences and their mutual love of fitness. Their conversations delved deeper into their lives, their challenges, and their growth. They discussed race, privilege, and the complexities of living in a world that so often put people into boxes based on appearances. For Sarah, these conversations were eye-opening. She learned about the subtle and overt forms of racism Nyla had faced throughout her life, and it made her more aware of the privileges she had taken for granted. She began advocating for change in her own social circles, speaking out against the kind of casual assumptions that had once led to her own misstep. For Nyla, the friendship was a chance to let her guard down. She realized that not every misunderstanding had to end in conflict, and that people, even those who seemed ignorant at first, were capable of growth. It wasn't always easy, but she learned that sometimes, giving people the benefit of the doubt could lead to something better. Chapter 11, the future ahead. As their friendship deepened, Sarah and Nyla found themselves reflecting on the strange way they had met. What had started as a moment of conflict had turned into something positive, something neither of them could have predicted. One evening, as they sat in a park after a long run, Sarah turned to Nyla and said, "You know, if someone had told me that the woman I almost fought on the street would end up being one of my best friends, I wouldn't have believed them." Nyla laughed, shaking her head. "Same here. Life is funny like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city was still bustling around them, full of people who, like them, were navigating their own lives, their own struggles, and their own misunderstandings. But for Sarah and Nyla, the city no longer felt quite as isolating. They had found a connection where they least expected it, and it had made the world feel a little bit smaller, a little bit kinder. As they stood to leave, Nyla glanced at Sarah with a smile. "Who knows? Maybe we're just getting started." Sarah smiled back, feeling the weight of the day lift from her shoulders. "Yeah," she said. "Maybe we are." And with that, they walked off into the city, two women from different worlds who had found common ground in the most unexpected of ways. Chapter 12, Strength in Unity. As the months went by, Sarah and Nyla's friendship continued to grow. They became sounding boards for one another, discussing not only their personal challenges but also the broader issues they faced in the world around them. Their friendship was no longer just about reconciliation after a misunderstanding, it became a symbol of how unity could grow from division, and how two people, seemingly worlds apart, could come together to create something meaningful. One day, during one of their regular coffee meetups, Nyla brought up a topic that had been on her mind. "Sarah, have you ever thought about doing something more with everything we've been talking about? Like, beyond just us?" Nyla asked, stirring her coffee. Sarah looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" Nyla leaned forward, her voice lowering with excitement. "I've been thinking, what if we took what we've learned, about race, about biases, about confronting assumptions, and started a conversation with more people? I don't know, maybe something online or in the community. A blog, a podcast, something." Sarah's eyes lit up at the idea. "That's actually a really good idea. We've had so many deep conversations, and I think a lot of people could benefit from hearing our perspective. It's one thing to read about these issues, but it's another to hear it from people who have lived it. Nyla nodded. Exactly. And we can focus on the power of communication, like what happened between us. It's about creating spaces for dialogue, where people can talk about their experiences and actually listen to each other. The more they talked, the more excited they became about the possibilities. They brainstormed ideas, coming up with names for their potential project and thinking about the different topics they could cover. It wasn't just about race, it was about empathy, about understanding, about bridging gaps between people from different walks of life. As they wrapped up their coffee, they had a new mission. It was no longer just about their personal growth, it was about using their experiences to inspire others. Chapter 13, the launch. Several weeks later, after countless hours of planning, Sarah and Nyla officially launched their project, a podcast called Bridging the Divide. It was a space where they could share their stories and invite others to do the same. The first episode, naturally, was about how they had met, their argument, their initial misunderstandings, and how they had grown from it. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the country reached out to them, sharing their own stories of misunderstandings, conflicts, and reconciliations. It seemed that their message had struck a chord. So many people had experienced moments like theirs but had never found the right way to talk about them. In one episode, they invited experts on racial bias to discuss the science behind prejudice and why it's so deeply ingrained in society. In another, they interviewed people from different cultural backgrounds, sharing their perspectives on how they had navigated difficult situations. Each episode was a conversation, and the goal was always the same: to foster understanding and encourage open dialogue. For both Sarah and Nyla, this project became more than just a hobby, it became a passion. They were learning as much as their listeners, and every story they heard helped them grow even further. Chapter 14, challenges along the way. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. As their podcast gained more attention, they began to face criticism from people who weren't ready to have these kinds of conversations. Some accused them of being too soft, of not addressing the real, systemic issues that caused prejudice and inequality. Others claimed they were being too idealistic, that one conversation couldn't fix the deep-rooted problems in society. But Sarah and Nyla were undeterred. They knew that real change didn't happen overnight. It happened through countless small actions, through the kinds of conversations they were encouraging. And even if they could change the mindset of just a few people, they believed it was worth it. At one point, they hosted a live event where listeners could come and meet them in person. The turnout was far beyond what they had expected. People from all walks of life showed up, eager to share their stories and connect with others who were trying to do the same. At the end of the event, Nyla stood up to give a closing speech. She looked out at the crowd, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. This all started with a misunderstanding, she began, her voice steady and strong. But what that experience taught me is that we all have the capacity to grow. We all have the power to change the way we see the world, if we're willing to listen. And today, looking out at all of you, I know that this is just the beginning. The room erupted in applause, and as Sarah joined Nyla on stage, they exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. They had started something special, something bigger than either of them had ever imagined. Chapter 15, the ripple effect. Over time, Bridging the Divide became more than just a podcast. It evolved into a movement. Schools reached out, asking Sarah and Nyla to speak to students about empathy and communication. Companies invited them to host workshops on bias and inclusivity. They were making a tangible difference in the world, one conversation at a time. For Sarah, this journey had opened her eyes to a reality she had never fully understood before. She had grown up in a world where her experiences were seen as the norm, but now she realized how limited that perspective had been. Working alongside Nyla, she had learned to listen more, to question her assumptions, and to be more open to the experiences of others. For Nyla, the journey was equally transformative. She had always been a fighter, someone who stood her ground in the face of injustice. But through this project, she had learned that there was power in vulnerability, too. Opening herself up to these conversations had allowed her to connect with people in ways she never thought possible. Together, they had created something that had the power to change lives. And while they knew they couldn't fix all the problems in the world, they had learned that sometimes, the most important changes start with something small, a conversation, a moment of understanding, a willingness to listen. Epilogue. The legacy. Years later, Sarah and Nyla still found themselves reflecting on the day they had collided on that busy city street. It was a day that had started with anger, frustration, and misunderstanding. But it had led them down a path that neither of them could have predicted, a path of growth, of friendship, and of creating change. Bridging the Divide continued to grow, reaching new audiences and sparking conversations in communities around the world. It had become more than just a podcast, it was a movement for empathy, for understanding, and for breaking down the barriers that divided people. And as Sarah and Nyla sat together, watching the latest episode of their show go live, they couldn't help but smile. They had come a long way from that heated argument on the street. They had taken a moment of conflict and turned it into something powerful, something lasting. That in the end, they had learned that the real power didn't come from being right. It came from being willing to listen, to grow, and to understand. And that, they both knew, was the kind of power that could change the world.